Everybody loves to have their hot takes, those opinions where they say, no, 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 you're wrong everybody and I'm right, and Terraria is no different. So a couple days ago I decided to go to the Terraria forums and ask people what their hot takes were for the game, and it could be anything really. There are a lot of interesting responses that I wanted to shed some light on and give my opinions on as well. So without further ado, let's get started. Not really hot, but navigating game progression for new players and whatnot is basically impossible unless you have a wiki on 24/7. Oh, also, Summoner sucks, but that's just me. Yeah, I kinda gotta agree with both of these opinions here. Obviously, we all know that game progression is pretty tough for new players nowadays. It's really a wiki game at heart. Maybe it's always been, but I feel like it's more of a wiki game now than ever. Windy Day is one of the best songs in the OST. Well, music is purely subjective and it's all up to your opinion, but I would have to disagree with this one pretty heavily. Windy Day is not a bad song, and on its own it's actually probably better than it is in the game, but I feel like it just doesn't fit Terraria like a few of the other songs do. The underground theme, the desert, the overworld, the ice biome, I mean, there are so many different Terraria songs which are so good and arguably much better than Windy Day. King Slime is not the easiest boss. Eye of Cthulhu is way easier than it. King Slime and Eye of Cthulhu are both extremely easy bosses, so I don't feel like it really matters to compare them. You're not gonna struggle with Eye of Cthulhu or King Slime even on expert mode. With that being said, I think this is a totally fair opinion to have. I personally find King Slime to be a little bit harder than Eye of Cthulhu. Maybe it's just that it does more damage or the arena's harder to build or something, but I actually agree. I think Eye of Cthulhu is a little bit easier than King Slime. Alright everybody, it's time to do a quick fire. This person's got a lot of opinions. Early game Summoner is easier than early game Mage. I gotta disagree with this one. I think early game Mage is pretty dang easy. Plantera is a disaster design-wise with no functional parts, even if it's not a particularly terrible experience to fight. Considering the fact that Plantera is extremely fun to fight, I feel like you can't really argue that it's poorly designed, because at the end of the day, the whole point of a boss fight is to be fun to fight. Terraria is not a wiki game after the relatively recent guide changes and the addition of the bestiary. Once again, I gotta disagree with this one. It's obviously easy to look at Terraria as somebody with hundreds of hours and say, look at these beginners. The game's not that hard to learn, but it definitely is, and new players struggle with this game a lot for very good reason. Wing slot is actually fine balance-wise, as wings already have drawbacks and nuances that make them equal to mounts after removing their accessory slot cost. If wing slot is overpowered, mounts are. Yeah, I don't really care either way, wing slot or not, I guess it's a cool idea, I don't really care. Lunatic Cultists would be an awesome boss and one of the highlights of the game if it was recontextualized to be completely isolated from the finale of the game and you didn't change anything else about it. I mean, at the end of the day, the reason the Cultists are so underwhelming in the first place is because it comes right before the ending of the game and it doesn't really feel appropriate, so fair enough. Terraria is at its strongest when you spend as little time worrying about bosses as possible. I agree that Terraria needs to have a little bit less of a focus on bosses for most players, but at the same time, bosses are ultimately the point of the game. It's a loot game about progression, and bosses are the gateway to progress. Potions are never a grind. I gotta disagree on this one because, as we all know, some potions require fishing, and fishing is most certainly grindy. Strange Dies being moved to hard mode made most of the player base's vanities look significantly better, even if I don't agree with the method they used to ensure that. Yeah, kinda true I guess. Auto fishing is actually completely fine balance-wise, so long as it still consumes bait and doesn't work during blood moons, as fishing doesn't have enough substance for me to feel like it's anything other than do nothing, get free items to begin with. I agree that auto fishing wouldn't be a huge balancing problem, but I do think it would make fishing even more boring, because having to stay alert and focus on when you can reel in the fish actually does make fishing at least a little bit more interesting. I mean, it's still one of the grindiest things about the game. I don't know if auto fishing would really fix that. And finally, what I feel is my hottest take, playthrough rules such as preventing world hopping, glitches, duplication, certain mods, etc. are entirely up to your interpretation unless you're in some kind of competition or multiplayer setting where you should lay rules and boundaries to begin with. Play the game however you want and don't enforce it on other people. Wait a second, based? The Terrorblade was a mistake. It power creeps melee progression and makes anything else afterwards either niche or useless. If nerfed, it would make the progress for it less fulfilling than if it didn't exist. Sucks because the component swords for it are genuinely fun and require skill to use effectively. This is probably the take I'm going to disagree with the most on this entire thread. Is the Terrorblade incredibly powerful? Yeah, Yes. Is it very good even up to Moonlord in classic mode? Absolutely. But is there a reason for that as well? Yes. The Terrablade is much harder to obtain than basically any other weapon in Terraria, at least any other melee weapon, and the reason for that is because it takes grinding certain weapons from the start of the game. It's not like this weapon completely ruins the balancing either. Weapons like the Daybreak or even the Solar Eruption at the end of the game are still much more valuable for fighting Moonlord than the Terrablade. And speaking of the Solar Eruption, this next hot take says, Solar Eruption is the most overhyped weapon ever. I don't know if I would say overhyped because I think a lot of people have acknowledged that it's not nearly as good as it used to be, but I would agree that the Solar Eruption really isn't that good. It's a great weapon for crowd control and invasions, but in terms of fighting bosses or other enemies, it's not nearly as good as a weapon like, say, the Daybreak. It's a really cool weapon, I think that it's very fun to use at times, but in terms of viability, I would agree that it's definitely one of the worst weapons for the pillars, and probably one of the worst late game weapons in general. All of post-Plantera irredeemably sucks. True. I've talked about this briefly before and in a couple videos, but Terraria's late game is almost certainly the most unbalanced and poorly designed stage of the game. It isn't bad by any means, I still think that it's pretty fun, and I probably wouldn't say that it irredeemably sucks. There are some cool things about it like Moonlord, but it's true that Terraria takes a big fall off in terms of quality after Plantera. Any wings below Fishron wings are not worth getting. I never even used them one single time even to see what they're like in my 1000 hour Terraria past. It is true that the Fishron wings are much better than basically any other wing in the game, at least for when you can obtain them, but most players will end up fighting Duke Fishron after Plantera, or at the earliest after the mechanical bosses, and having wings for the mech bosses is incredibly useful. For most players, it is more than important to go out of your way to get either angel wings, demon wings, or fairy wings, because they are incredibly useful. Obviously, some really good pro player isn't gonna need wings to fight most of the bosses in this game, but wings are incredibly useful right after hard mode, and there's a reason most players go out of their way to get them. Imagining Zenith doesn't exist for a second, post-Moonlord content could actually be fun, and it is a shame that there's not much to use all the really good cool post-Moonlord gear against. I'm not saying there should be a progression past Moonlord, another boss that drops even better gear would create the same problem again, but something like a post-game high score challenge invasion, similar to the Frost Moon, would be cool. I see where this guy is coming from, but at the same time I feel like this is extremely unnecessary. There is still so much stuff in Terraria that you can do after Moonlord. Cleanse the world evil, unlock the final few NPCs if you haven't, fill out the bestiary. Sure, Terraria doesn't have some crazy high score system after you beat the game or whatever to test your newfound weapons, but it basically challenges you in other ways. And yeah, the post-Moonlord weapons are very cool, and it's kind of a shame that you can't use them on anything to test your power, but at the same time, I don't really feel like an invasion would solve that problem. These weapons are meant to feel overpowered because you get them after beating the game and there's basically no challenge. That's basically the whole point of the weapons. Obviously, there's stuff like the Calamity mod which makes use of these post-Moonlord weapons by just expanding past Moonlord, but like this person mentioned in their post, that wouldn't really be a solution either. And that's all of the hot takes we're going to be discussing for today. Make sure to leave a comment with your hot takes for Terraria. I will be trying to reply to as many as possible today because I'm interested in seeing what you guys are thinking, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.